In February 2008, a winding-up petition landed on the desk of a small football club on the south coast of England. The tax authorities were owed money. The debts had reached £4 million. The administrators walked in. A 10-point deduction was handed down. The club fell to the bottom of League One, the third tier of English football, and were relegated. Then, before a ball had even been kicked the following season, they were handed another 17-point penalty. 17 points, before the season started. The Football League came within a breath of expelling them entirely. Fans held emergency meetings and passed buckets around to raise money just to keep the club alive. That club was AFC Bournemouth. And in May 2026, 18 years later, they qualified for European football for the first time in their entire 127-year history, finishing 6th in the Premier League with a record points total, and booking a place in the UEFA Europa League. From the edge of extinction to the continent, this is how they did it. Welcome to Football Detailing, and let's get started. To appreciate how extraordinary this story is, you need to sit for a moment inside those darkest days and understand exactly how close AFC Bournemouth came to simply ceasing to exist. The club had been struggling financially for years before 2008. They had actually entered administration once before, in the late 1990s, when a winding-up petition from the Inland Revenue over an unpaid tax bill of £350,000 had threatened their existence. Fans rallied then too, holding public meetings, buying shares at £50 each, raising money through bucket collections at the Winter Gardens in Bournemouth Town Centre. The club survived. But the problems never truly went away. They were managed, patched over, and quietly accumulated behind the scenes for another decade until, in February 2008, the whole structure gave way completely. The 10-point deduction dropped them into the relegation zone immediately. They could not recover. Down they went to League Two, the fourth tier of English football, a division that sits just one step above non-league football. And then, before they had even started life in that fourth tier, the Football League hit them with a further 17-point deduction for failing to follow insolvency rules properly during the change of ownership. 17 points removed before a single match had been played. The club sat on -17. It was a number so surreal, so alarming, that it barely seemed real. The Football League at that point was seriously considering blocking Bournemouth from competing at all. They were ordered to prove they could fulfill their fixtures. It was not a formality. It was a genuine threat. And the only thing that saved them, in those weeks of crisis, was a combination of fan fundraising, emergency funds from Chairman Jeff Mostyn, and an intervention from a local businessman named Paul Baker, who prevented the club from going into full liquidation. The supporters of a club that averaged fewer than 5,000 fans per home game had collectively willed it back from the brink. In January 2009, with the club still mired in the wreckage of that 17-point deduction and sitting in genuine danger of dropping out of the Football League entirely, AFC Bournemouth made a decision that would define the next 15 years of their history. They appointed a 31-year-old former Bournemouth player, a man who had captained the club and retired through injury just 2 years earlier, as their manager. His name was Howe, and at the time he was the youngest manager in the top 4 professional divisions of English football. What followed that appointment is one of the most famous single results in the club's history. On the final day of the 2008 to 2009 season, still deep in the relegation zone before the run-in, Howe guided Bournemouth to a victory over Grimsby Town that kept them in the Football League by the narrowest possible margin. It became known simply as the Great Escape. A club that had spent the entire season in crisis, buried under points deductions, playing through administration and ownership chaos, surviving on the last day by a single result. That moment crystallized something important about what Eddie Howe was building. It was not just tactical, it was cultural. He was a Bournemouth man. He knew the club, knew the town, knew the fans. He brought an intensity and a belief that was completely disproportionate to the resources available to him. And from that survival, he built upwards with a relentlessness that was remarkable to watch. Promotion from League Two in 2010, a brief spell away at Burnley, then a return to Bournemouth. Promotion from League One in 2013, and then the achievement that made the football world stop and take notice, the championship title in 2015, taking a club from the 4th division to the top flight of English football in 6 years. 6 years from the brink of non-league football to the Premier League. It remains one of the most rapid ascents in the history of the English football pyramid. Bournemouth went from a stadium with a capacity of 11,000, one of the smallest in professional football, to competing against Manchester United, Chelsea, and Arsenal every single week. The club that fans had passed buckets around to save was now a Premier League club. Howe left in 2020 when the club were relegated after 5 seasons in the top flight, eventually going on to manage Newcastle United. But the foundation he had built, the culture, the identity, the belief that this club could compete at the highest level, did not leave with him. It had been absorbed into the club's DNA. One of the less discussed but enormously important chapters in Bournemouth's story is the ownership transition that gave the club the financial stability it had never previously had. In 2011, a Russian-born businessman and former commodities trader named Maxim Demin began investing in the club. By 2013, he held a majority stake, and by 2019, he owned the club outright. Demin was not flashy. He gave no press conferences. He made no grand speeches about ambitions and targets. He simply funded the club's operations sensibly, backed the manager in the transfer market, and stayed out of the dressing room. That quiet, stable ownership, so different from the chaotic, debt-ridden governance that had pushed the club to the edge in 2008, gave Howe the platform to build without the constant fear of financial collapse, pulling the ground out from under him. Then, in December 2022, American businessman Bill Foley acquired a majority stake in the club. Foley, who also owns the Vegas Golden Knights ice hockey franchise, brought a different kind of ambition, structured, long-term, and commercially savvy. He inherited a club that had just returned to the Premier League under Scott Parker as championship runners-up, and within 2 years of his arrival, publicly stated his belief that Bournemouth would qualify for European football within 5 years of his takeover. As it turned out, it happened in 3. After Scott Parker brought the club back up as championship runners-up in 2022, and Gary O'Neill steadied them through their first season back with a 15th place finish, Bournemouth made another bold appointment in June 2023. They sacked O'Neill, a decision that shocked many at the time given he had just kept them up, and replaced him with Andoni Iraola, a Basque Spaniard who had spent 3 seasons building Rayo Vallecano into one of Spanish football's most organized and difficult-to-beat sides on a fraction of the budget of their rivals. Iraola's football is intense, aggressive, and deeply structured. He demands high pressing, constant movement, and a relentless work rate from every single player on the pitch, regardless of their status or position. His teams do not sit deep and absorb. They hunt. They press the opposition into mistakes. They transition quickly, and they play with an energy and directness that is immediately recognizable as his, regardless of which club he is managing. He is, by the accounts of everyone who has worked with him, obsessive in the detail of his preparation and remarkably calm in the way he communicates it, a combination that players at every club he has managed have responded to with almost instant improvement. In his first season at Bournemouth, the club finished 12th in the Premier League, a solid, assured debut campaign. Then, in his second, 2024-25, they finished 9th, their joint highest Premier League finish ever, and broke their record for points in a single top-flight campaign with 56. Opposition managers began talking about how uncomfortable Bournemouth were to face. Pep Guardiola described Iraola as one of the best coaches in England. Results against the biggest clubs, wins over Arsenal, Manchester City, Manchester United, and Newcastle, became a recurring feature of Bournemouth's season rather than the shock upsets they would have been under any previous manager. Then came 2025-26, and everything accelerated. Bournemouth went on a 17-match unbeaten run in the Premier League across the middle of the season, one of the longest unbeaten runs by any club in the division that year. They scored more goals from substitutes than any other side in the league. Young players developed under Iraola began emerging as genuine talents. Most notably, Eli Jr. Krupi, who became one of the highest-scoring teenagers in Europe under his guidance. The squad had lost important players along the way. Antoine Semenyo sold in January, and yet Iraola continued to maximize every resource available to him with a consistency that spoke to the depth of his coaching ability rather than the depth of his budget. They finished 6th, 59 points, a new club record, and a place in the UEFA Europa League. The first time in AFC Bournemouth's 127-year history that they will play European football. A club with an 11,000-capacity ground, a club that fans had passed buckets around to save 18 years ago, now going to Europe. And then came the news that Bournemouth fans had been dreading. Despite the club's best efforts, despite owner Bill Foley flying in personally for contract talks, despite repeated offers of new terms over 15 months of negotiations, Andoni Iraola informed his players and the club that he would be leaving at the end of the season. He turned down every offer to extend his stay, with reports linking him to his former club, Athletic Club, in the Basque Country of Spain, a club with deep personal meaning to a man who played there and built his entire footballing identity in that environment. The manner of his departure, by all accounts, was handled with the same dignity and mutual respect that defined his entire time at Bournemouth. There is no bad blood, no reported fallouts. He simply chose a different path at a different moment in his career. They did not panic. They did not drift. On April 20th, 2026, while Iraola was still in the dugout for the final weeks of the season, the club moved quickly and decisively to confirm their next head coach. They appointed Marco Rose on a 3-year contract. Rose, 49 years old and German, had been without a club since being sacked by RB Leipzig in March 2025. But his CV is serious, and his credentials are exactly what Bournemouth needed. Red Bull Salzburg, 2 league titles and the Austrian Cup. Borussia Mönchengladbach, Borussia Dortmund, RB Leipzig, where he won the DFB Pokal and the German Super Cup. He has managed in the Bundesliga, qualified for, and coached in both the Champions League and Europa League, and built a strong reputation across his career for high-pressing, direct, attacking football. Precisely the identity Iraola had established at Bournemouth, and that the club's ownership was determined to protect and continue. The Bournemouth hierarchy were explicit about why Rose was chosen ahead of the other candidates on their shortlist, which also included Ipswich Town's Kieran McKenna and Rayo Vallecano's Inigo Perez. His style of play mirrors Iraola's closely enough that the transition should be significantly smoother than a wholesale change in philosophy would allow. Hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think Marco Rose is the right man to take Bournemouth into Europe? And how far do you think this club can go? Let us talk. See you in the next one.